Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson today. We will be listening to cold cases that has finally been solved in 2022.
Uttered in a phone call made by the younger brother of Kevin Drinks. The family rushed to the hospital assuming Kevin was involved in an accident, only to discover he'd been killed in a shooting. Those four words continued to haunt Kenya Drinks for 10 years until the men responsible for killing her husband Kevin were finally brought to justice. Kevin, who was 50 years old, was gunned down on December 10th, 2011. He was parked behind Underground Market Furniture in North Philadelphia. He had just started work 4 days prior as a delivery driver. He was shot 3 times just after 6:30 p.m. and was rushed to hospital where he died shortly after arriving. For the family, it was a puzzling situation. Anyone who knew Kevin knew he was a doting grandfather who regularly went to church and sang gospel songs. To him, family was everything. For Kenya, though, she had lost the love of her life. Kevin and Kenya met back in 1978, high school sweethearts who attended their Germanstown High School prom together. However, they broke up after graduation. 2 decades later, they reconnected after Kenya's mother passed away in the year 2000. Kevin stopped by to pay his respects. The rest was history. Kevin was a divorcee, but that didn't stop Kenya from making the best of this second chance. The two married in 2001, with Kevin serenading Kenya as she walked down the aisle. 10 years later, in 2011, they bought their dream home together in Ronhurst. For the next few months, they would spend time in their home, filling it with a shared love for each other. Kevin loved his family and enjoyed spending time with his 3 daughters and 5 grandchildren. Those were the last few months Kenya would share with her beloved husband. No one could foresee the call from Kevin's younger brother that was the end to the fairy tale she was building with Kevin. The only question on everyone's mind was, who would want to kill Kevin? Nothing panned out from the investigations made by police. People began to whisper that maybe there was something more to the killing. The home she built with Kevin became a shell of its former glory. But Kenya and Kevin's family didn't back down. She persisted with keeping up the investigation with police. T-shirts and buttons featuring Kevin's face were printed and distributed. Flyers were constantly circulated to ensure the memory of his case remained alive. The Justice for Kevin Drinks movement began. Kenya called upon elected officials to take action and shut down the whispers of Kevin being involved in underhand dealings. Frustration grew as other cases were being solved, but the Drinks family persisted in their unwavering belief that justice would be served. A month after Kevin's murder, Kenya called upon State Representative W. Curtis Thomas. There was a vigil and news conference organized by Thomas. We all must begin to take ownership and responsibility in our communities and stand up against the lawless element that's committed the crime. What happened to Kevin Drinks could happen to any of us, said Thomas. Thomas went on to implore community members to join in community policing. He said that everyone needed to come together in order to stop this senseless violence. Thomas called for the formation of a police substation along the busy corridor and an increase in bike patrols and beat cops. Captain Branville G. Bard agreed with Thomas and added to the sentiment felt by many present at the vigil. This is our community, and we live here. We're imploring people to speak up, he said. He mentioned that every day that passes and Kevin's murderer goes without being caught showed that people just didn't care. The vigil fed a fire in Kenya until time started to get the best of her and her faith in justice. Kenya prayed. She eventually moved away from the painful memories and also out of fear for her safety. Over time, though, her faith began to dwindle. Kenya understood the police were overwhelmed, but sometimes wondered if Kevin's case was even being worked on. But frustration grew. Kenya feared the case was going to grow ice cold. Slowly, she stopped calling the police as frequently as she used to. Kenya said her calls were often met with a patronizing attitude. She grew disappointed, questioning what was so hard in finding Kevin's killer. Her faith was further knocked when police were able to solve the killing of a fellow officer who was killed after Kevin. Killing an officer is the highest level of disrespect. I understand that. But if the department were willing to pull every stop to find someone who shot one of their own, Why couldn't they do that for Kevin? She asked. Kenya became vocal about the lack of action in Kevin's case. I want justice for every murder victim in the city. If you take an oath to protect us, you should treat us the same as you would an officer, she said. She waited, biding her time as the case grew colder. Years passed with no new leads or feedback. And then there was a break in the case. In 2018, she got the call she'd been waiting for. It was a bittersweet moment when Kenya and her family discovered that Kevin was killed in a case of mistaken identity. Philadelphia police detective John Verrecchio had been listening in on recordings of jailhouse conversations. They were investigating a different case through the coded conversations between prisoners when he stumbled across a conversation related to Kevin's case. 2 months before Kevin was killed, Chad Rannells had been accused of murdering a 22-year-old man named Kristen Freeman. Rannells was worried about a witness that was going to testify against him, so he plotted with 3 other men, Michael Blackston, Samaj Armstead, and Rashawn Combs. The men were discussing the description of the witness, his workplace, and the kind of car he drove. They were formulating a plot to kill him and went through with it in December 2011. The witness they wanted to silence bore a striking resemblance to Kevin Drinks. They had killed the wrong man. The jailhouse conversation led to the convictions of the 4 men. In March 2022, all 4 men were found guilty of murder, conspiracy, and related charges in the death of Kevin Drinks. Rannells, Blackston, and Armstead were found guilty in the first degree and sentenced to life imprisonment. Combs was given the lesser charge of third-degree murder. His sentencing was due to be heard on June 29th. It was later revealed that Michael Blackston was accused of killing 5 other people, with police saying the number qualified him as a serial killer. Following the sentencing, Kenya praised the work done by Assistant District Attorney Ashley Toxalowski and Christian Wynn. She also thanked Witness Victim Coordinator Kathy Lees and called them her dream team. District Attorney Larry Krasner held a press conference in April 2022 near the place where Kevin was gunned down. Krasner told everyone present that Drinks was under surveillance for an entire day before he was killed in a case of mistaken identity. He then invited Kenya to speak. Though nervous at first, she took the stand and looked at the button that read, "Justice for Kevin Drinks," the one she and her family and friends had worn for a decade. Then she spoke. "Family, take the buttons off. Justice is done. Justice is served. We don't need those buttons anymore." For Kenya, her eyes have been opened to the number of families who, like her, still wait for answers surrounding the unsolved murders of their loved ones. One such person was a woman who stood by Kenya through the trial, Kathy Lees. Kathy confided to Kenya that her own son, Justin Reyes, was gunned down just 6 months prior to Kevin's murder. The case remains unsolved, but by seeing Kenya's persistence and ultimate victory in getting the answers she needed, Kathy has hope that she too would one day find the answers to her own son's murder. For 3 decades, the death of 22-year-old Susan Amy Morse baffled investigators. However, investigators now believe that they may have found the man responsible for the murder of Susan and a separate sexual assault that occurred in the same apartment complex a year later. When Susan failed to show up for work on August 16, 1989, her parents grew concerned. They requested police do a welfare check as Susan's absence was uncharacteristic behavior. Susan lived alone in the Mesa apartment. Police entered the apartment, which was eerily quiet, and made a gruesome discovery. Susan had been beaten and asphyxiated with an extension cord, the covers of her bed pulled up around her body. Police later discovered she had also been sexually assaulted. There were no leads, despite police canvassing the area and asking neighbors questions. No information surfaced, and the case was pushed to the back burner. A year later, in November 1990, another incident occurred at the same apartment complex. A 23-year-old woman called police to report a break-in. She told police that she awoke to a man holding a knife to her stomach. He told her that he was not going to hurt her, just rape her. The man reportedly crawled in through an open window. He sexually assaulted the woman, but left her alive. Her attacker then stole cash and a VCR before escaping. Following the second attack in the apartment complex, investigators looked back at evidence from both crime scenes and determined that the crimes were connected. There was no suspect in the case, though. For years, both cases sat cold at the Mesa Police Department. Susan's parents unfortunately passed away before they could get the answers they wanted. The technology of the time was not as advanced to determine the DNA profile of the suspect responsible for the murder and sexual assault cases. The break in the unsolved cases came in March 2022. Through genetic genealogy testing, DNA recovered from both crime scenes were used to develop a family tree for the suspect. The search was narrowed down until one name popped up: Thomas Cox. Mesa Police Department Sergeant Chuck Trapani said it was constant searching for newer advanced technology in testing DNA that helped with the solving of cases. In the case of Thomas Cox and Susan Morse, it worked out dramatically. Cox, who is 58 years old, was identified through familial markers. What cemented investigators' pursuit of him was the fact that Cox's mother lived next door to Susan at the time of her murder. In initial investigations, he'd never been considered a person of interest in either case. Police staked out Cox's Colorado Springs home and recovered a styrofoam cup, lid, and straw. The DNA lifted from the recovered items matched that of the DNA found at both crime scenes. Furthermore, a print lifted from a screen that had been removed from one of the victim's windows matched the prints of Cox. These were already in the system after he committed several misdemeanors in the 80s and 90s. Cox was linked to another attack of an unnamed victim around November 13, 1990. In March 2022, Cox was indicted following the 1989 killing of Susan and the sexual assault at the same apartment complex in November 1990. He was charged with a total of 16 counts in both cases that included first-degree murder, sexual assault, burglary, and kidnapping. On April 23, 2022, Cox was extradited from El Paso County to Maricopa County. He was held on a $1 million cash bond. The FBI in Phoenix, who also assisted with the case, released a statement that read, "The passage of time does not deter law enforcement's persistence for truth and justice." Authorities were able to make contact with an aunt and cousin of Susan's, who expressed their relief in having finally caught the man responsible for her death. On May 4, 2022, the Mesa Police Department released a statement from one of Cox's victims who wished to remain anonymous. In it, she said that she didn't believe this day would come. She was thankful for the work done by Detective Samuel and the Mesa Police Department. She also passed her deepest sympathies to the family of Susan Morse and said that, "I didn't know Susan, but my fight became her fight. My pain became her pain, and my tears were her tears." She ended by saying that she learned how to stop being a victim and start being a survivor, despite what Thomas Cox took from her that night. For the criminals in these cases, it may have taken decades before they were captured and made to answer for their crimes, but the law never stops. On August 25, 1995, a passerby discovered the remains of a woman in a sleeping bag along Pine Hill Road in Kitsap County. When police responded, they discovered the woman was naked and suffered 2 gunshot wounds to the head. She was later identified through her fingerprints as Patricia Lorraine Barnes, a 61-year-old native of Seattle. Barnes was a somewhat well-recognized figure. People called her the Towel Lady, as she was often seen wearing a towel or bandana wrapped around her head. She was homeless and bounced between homeless shelters in Seattle. She was also known to frequent the Pioneer Square area. Police ruled her death a homicide and collected over 130 items of evidence from the crime scene. In an attempt to find leads, police canvassed the area and witnesses came forward with information regarding Barnes's whereabouts prior to the discovery. Some alleged to have seen her with a white male aged 30 to 35 years old. The pair allegedly told another man they planned to eat at Courthouse Park before making their way to Federal Way. It was the first time they saw this man with her. No one saw Barnes again until her body was discovered dumped on the roadside. A composite sketch was drawn up, but no leads came from the picture after it was circulated. Police also believe Barnes may have been the victim of Robert Lee Yates, known as the Spokane serial killer, a murderer who had shot his victims before dumping their bodies in remote locations. Barnes did not exactly fit the profile of Yates's victims, but the similarities in the murder were striking. He was, however, ruled out when police discovered he was stationed in Alabama during the time of Barnes's murder. The case went cold. In 2018, a renewed interest developed in solving cold cases following the use of genetic genealogy to track killers who had previously gone undetected. Barnes's case was reopened in 2018 as part of a division-wide focus on past cold cases. Given the amount of physical evidence, investigators began looking through the pieces of the puzzle that was the Barnes murder. They re-interviewed past detectives and began exploring new DNA testing tools that had become available. This time around, Yates was excluded from the investigation, as a thorough review of his movements placed him out of town during the time of Barnes' murder. In August 2020, acting on earlier information, a search warrant for DNA was executed in Houston, Texas, with the assistance of the Harris County District Attorney's Office. Investigators followed up on a lead regarding a person of interest who was believed to be the last person to see Barnes alive. The DNA sample taken from the person did not match what was recovered from Barnes or the crime scene. Investigators pushed for further testing and discovered that a single unidentified male DNA profile was found on 3 separate evidence sources at the crime scene. The DNA was found on Barnes's body and matched that of a cigarette butt that was discarded near her body. After putting the profile into CODIS, there was still no match. Whoever had killed Barnes was not entered into the national database. With leads now exhausted despite the technology, KCSO partnered with Othram Labs. They were able to create a genealogical profile, and Othram Labs worked hard to narrow down to a specific person. There was a lead found in December 2021. Acting on the information, KCSO investigators followed the lead down to Nogales, Arizona. With assistance from the Arizona Police Department, they tracked down the identified suspect, Douglas Keith Crone. Crone was a career criminal. He had 5 felony convictions to his name, according to records in Washington. This included a conviction for first-degree robbery in 1984. He was also arrested in Pierce County in 1994 for kidnapping in the 2nd degree. For some reason, though, his DNA was not entered into any criminal database. In an ironic twist of fate, Crone was already dead. He had allegedly been electrocuted while installing a television antenna that hit a nearby power line in September 2016. It was his death, however, that helped investigators in identifying his connection to the DNA. With help from the Arizona Police Department and Pima County Medical Examiner's Office, biological material taken from Crone's post-mortem was allowed to be used to match the DNA profile developed by investigators. In January 2022, Washington State Patrol Crime Lab concluded the biological material from Crone's post-mortem matched the DNA extracted from Barnes's crime scene and the discarded cigarette butt. Kitsap County Sheriff's Office Detective Mike Grant called the cigarette butt the linchpin that blew the case open. The evidence on the body could mean one of 2 or 3 different things, but when you have a cigarette butt with the DNA, and the DNA on her body, and on items around her body, it was conclusive to me that we had the right guy, he said. Detectives also realized the initial composite sketch bared a striking resemblance to Crone, who would have been around 33 years old at the time of the murder. Grant reached out to the family of Barnes, who were described as being shocked and grateful that they have answers now after nearly 30 years of uncertainty. Lori Houts. Lori Ann Houts was born in Las Vegas, Nevada on February 6, 1967. She was the 3rd among 4 siblings. Growing up, Lori cherished her friends and family as much as they cherished her. Attending Gunderson High School in San Jose, California, Lori was a bright student who also participated in many sports. Her love for technology put her ahead of her time. Eventually, Lori would go on to earn a well-established engineering position in one of the largest tech companies, Adobe Systems. Soon she moved to Silicon Valley and was living in an apartment on Charleston Road in Santa Clara County. She reportedly also had a loving relationship with her boyfriend, who has never been named. On September 5, 1992, Lori left for work, but she never arrived there. On the same day, during his regular run, a jogger made a gruesome discovery on the 1300 block of Crittenden in Mountain View, now the site of Google's campus. A woman was found dead in the passenger seat of her car near a garbage dump. Authorities were notified about the discovery, and they identified the woman as 25-year-old Lori Houtz. A nylon rope was still around her neck, which suggested she had been strangled to death. The crime scene did not hold many clues for investigators. Latent footprints were found both inside and outside of her car. Lori's footprints were found on the dashboard, indicating that a struggle had occurred. However, it was not a robbery. Her wallet was found nearby, undisturbed. Lori was found just 2 miles away from her workplace. Initially, investigators focused on the boyfriend as an obvious suspect. Yet he was ruled out later when his fingerprints did not match the fingerprints found on Lori's car. However, the prints matched another person who was close to him, his roommate, John Kevin Woodwards. John was someone who could absolutely have been the assailant. Not only were his fingerprints in Lori's car, but he had a possible motive too. Allegedly, John was not a fan of Lori. He was somewhat jealous of her, as he had growing romantic feelings towards his roommate, her boyfriend. Besides that, Lori's success in the tech world, a place that was dominated by males in the 90s, was something else that irked him greatly. When Lori's boyfriend asked him if he killed Lori, he did not give him a straight answer. Instead, he asked what information the investigators had. This behavior was both strange and suspicious. A month after the killing, John Woodwards was arrested for murder. At the 1995 trial, John's defense claimed that he had inadvertently left fingerprints on Lori's car because it was parked in front of his house some days before the murder. Prosecutors could not place him inside the vehicle. The first trial resulted in a hung jury. A second trial was held in 1996, but also resulted in a hung jury and was declared a mistrial. A judge dismissed the charges, saying he could not be charged again without new evidence. After the second trial, John moved to the Netherlands. Despite the possible suspect and developments made in the case early on, this case went cold. However, the investigation remained open. 30 years later, detectives successfully connected John Woodwards, now 58 and a software firm CEO, to Lori Houtz's murder. With the help of new DNA technology, they were able to extract new evidence from the original crime scene and compare it with John's DNA. His DNA matched the DNA found on the rope tied around Lori's neck. In July 2022, after police received a tip that John was heading back to the US, they caught him at JFK Airport after he landed. He was arrested in New York, where he's currently being held pending extradition to California. If found guilty, he's facing life in prison. The family stated after the arrest that this is not a win because they still don't get to have their sister back, but they're hopeful that they will finally get some justice for her. Susan Winters. Susan Arlene Winters was born on March 14, 1966, to Danny and Avis Winters in Oklahoma. Her parents and older brother Christopher adored her from the day she was born. In 1984, Susan was phenomenal in both studies and sports. She led her high school softball team to the state championship. She kept running and won her age bracket in marathons. She went on to study law after obtaining a graduate degree in political science from Oklahoma University. Her career flourished from the start. She worked for a year in the Clark County District Attorney's Office, toiled at a Las Vegas law firm, and sometimes filled in as a judge in North Las Vegas Justice Court. While Susan succeeded well in her career, it was time for her to start a family. She married Brent Dennis in August 1995, a psychologist by profession. Their first daughter, Avis L., was born 4 years later in October 1999. The family welcomed a second daughter, Anna Danielle, in April 2002. Susan was passionate about every aspect of her life. She was an avid reader, a marathon runner, an animal lover, and a devoted mother and wife. Despite being a hardworking attorney at her workplace, she dedicated all her free time to her family. It would all change on January 3rd, 2015. At 6:48 a.m. that day, Susan's husband, Brent Dennis, called 911 after finding his 48-year-old wife unresponsive in bed. Paramedics quickly arrived to find Susan holding on to life, and she was taken to the hospital. Unfortunately, at 2:26 p.m., Susan passed away after Dennis instructed doctors to take his wife off life support. According to Dennis, his wife committed suicide. He claimed he found 2 bottles of antifreeze in the garage and assumed that Susan had drunk the antifreeze at some point. When asked why his wife committed suicide, Dennis told police that he and Susan had been fighting for quite some time. Susan was drinking while on antidepressant medication for depression and threatened to kill herself many times. Dennis also claimed he slept the entire night and woke up to find Susan unresponsive. According to the coroner's report, Susan died of a combination of ethylene glycol poisoning and oxycodone intoxication. Ethylene glycol is the main ingredient in antifreeze, so her death has been ruled a suicide. However, the strangest thing in this case was that no evidence in the bedroom showed Susan harmed herself. Detectives found no suicide note, no glass with antifreeze remnants of liquid in it, and no prescription bottles or antifreeze containers. An impossible scenario regarding the probability of suicide. Although Susan's death was already deemed a suicide and the case was closed, the Winters family was not ready to accept that she chose to take her own life. In 2016, Susan's parents, Danny and Avis Winters, hired retired FBI detective and attorney Tony Sergo, who filed a civil lawsuit against Brent Dennis on their behalf. Apparently, the suit alleges that Susan died under suspicious circumstances and blames her demise on Dennis, who had a financial motive. Indeed, Dennis was very keen on the financial benefit that originated from his wife's death. He stood to benefit from a $1 million life insurance policy taken out on Susan's life. He was also the beneficiary of Susan's inheritance worth $1 million. Within 2 days of his wife's death, he was in talks with the insurance company. Apart from monetary benefits, Brent Dennis had a much darker secret. The more Sergo dug deeper, the more Dennis looked like a suspect. Sergo found many clues that have never been looked at before. Clues that paint another picture of this respected Nevada psychologist. In his own investigation, Detective Sergo discovered significant evidence against Dennis, including a substance abuse addiction and a connection to a man named Jeffrey Crosby, who had a past conviction of selling cocaine. During his civil deposition, Dennis admitted to buying drugs from Crosby.
What was the mechanism through which he would purchase controlled substances from Jeffrey?
Pay him cash, and he would provide me substance.
When the secret was out, Susan was mad. The situation deteriorated in such a way that Dennis had to seek treatment for his drug abuse. Phone records showed 6 calls and texts from Susan's phone to Crosby's phone in the days before her death. She allegedly called Crosby to inform him she was going to the authorities. Susan wanted her husband to stop using drugs. But the addiction did not stop there. It was revealed that Susan had previously threatened to report his alleged drug use to authorities. Cell phone records obtained by the family lawyers showed she called and sent text messages to Crosby several times in the days before her death to stop him from selling drugs to Dennis. Interestingly enough, she confided in some friends that her marriage was falling apart the day before she died. Avis and Danny insisted Susan did not kill herself. According to her parents, she was a bit upset, but in no way did that lead to her committing suicide. In fact, Susan purchased airline tickets to San Jose, California, Atlanta, and Hawaii to attend her daughter Anna's cheerleading competitions. Susan's parents said she was really excited that Anna would be attending college. Dennis had previously claimed that Susan had searched for antifreeze several times before her death, which made him believe that she took her own life by consuming antifreeze. But months later, investigators discovered that the last of the searches for antifreeze poisoning was done at 5:15 a.m., when Susan was already unconscious and nearly dead. Dennis also traveled to Orleans to meet with Crosby on 4 occasions after her death between January 9, 2015 and March 27, 2015. After consistent insistence from the Winter family and with newfound clues, detectives decided to revisit the case. In February 2017, during a traffic stop near his home, Dennis was arrested on suspicion of open murder with a deadly weapon. Allegedly, he received prescription painkillers from his own patients. Interestingly, even at the time of his arrest, he had 3 painkiller pills in his right pocket. He was formally charged with voluntary manslaughter after being taken into custody. In April 2017, Susan's manner of death was changed from suicide to undetermined following Dennis's arrest. While Dennis remained free on $250,000 bail, he entered an Alford plea in which he does not admit guilt, but concedes that prosecutors have sufficient evidence to prove his guilt. 4 years after Susan's tragic demise, Dennis was finally sentenced to serve 3 to 10 years in prison for voluntary manslaughter in connection with the 2015 death of his wife. While the Winters family is relieved by the outcome, Susan's daughters, who are now 22 and 20 years old, stood by their father. In a statement in court, they wrote that their father only entered the Alford plea in the case to avoid the harsher punishment, but had nothing to do with their mother's death. Whatever the outcome is, Susan's parents expressed their grief over losing contact with their granddaughters. While Susan is never coming back, hopefully the two families can find their way back to each other through the healing process. Barbara Jepson. Barbara Jean Jepson, a newly married 18-year-old, started her new life with her husband, Joe Jepson, in a lovely home in Van Nuys, California. As a National Air Guard, Joe earned a good living, so it's not a surprise that they planned to extend their family soon after marriage. They married in 1955, and Barbara conceived her first child that same year. By January of 1956, Barbara was in her 4th month of pregnancy. January 31st, 1956 was a normal day when Joe left his home for work early in the morning. Feeling bored at home, Barbara went shopping later in the day. Locals saw her around 12:30 p.m. She returned home soon after. When Joe returned home from work, a bloody scene awaited him. In the bedroom, Joe discovered Barbara's naked body on the mattress with a 10-inch butcher's knife stuck in her chest. Joe covered his wife with a blanket and then called the police. As detectives reached the crime scene, they found several items of evidence. A military green jacket with blood traces was found a few feet away from Barbara's body. Some hair follicles from an unknown person were also found in the garage. However, important items such as bedsheets, pillow covers, and a bloody rug found in the sink were not collected, since DNA technology was not available back then. The body was sent for examination, and reports came back stating that she'd been killed sometime between 1 p.m. and 4 p.m. It was also mentioned that she had been sexually assaulted before being brutally stabbed to death. The crime scene showed no forced entry, no stolen items, nor any signs of struggle, which led investigators to believe that she might have known her attacker. Upon questioning neighbors, 2 witnesses came forward. One person said he saw a person who did not live in the community roaming around the area that day, wearing a green jacket. Another witness saw a man with big hands and big knuckles. Barbara was considered another victim of a series of sexual assaults that were going on in the nearby area. Police questioned every person who had committed crimes like this in the area, but could not link anyone to Barbara's murder. They initially suspected her husband, Joe, but he was eventually ruled out, as it was proven that he was at work during the murder. With no suspects, detectives reached a dead end. Despite combing through the evidence over the years, the search for Barbara's killer would remain unsolved and her case would remain cold. In 2016, DNA testing was completed on multiple items collected from the crime scene, but there was not enough DNA to submit the findings to the CODIS system for a match. Moreover, the suspect's DNA had most likely never been entered into the CODIS system. By 2019, Los Angeles police detective Rachel Evans had joined the cold case unit. The very first case assigned to her was Barbara Jepson's case. She set off re-examining the leads and looking for clues to identify the killer, which no detectives had been successful in doing for the past 60 years. It took her a whole week to read the entire case file the first time, yet she kept reading it again and again. By the third time, she picked up on a few things that had not been given much importance by previous investigators. She noted the fact that there was no sign of forced entry, which suggested that Barbara most likely knew her killer. No items were taken from the scene, pointing towards the motive not being robbery. Based on the assumption that Barbara knew her assailant, Evans started putting the pieces together and focused her investigation on one person, Monty Mertz. Born in 1911 in Utah, Mertz had several relationships over the years. He first got married to Cleo Ream in 1931, with whom he had one son and one daughter, but that marriage fell apart. After the divorce, he married another woman named Bernice, but that marriage also did not last long. In 1945, during the divorce, Bernice cited cruelty as a cause. Indeed, Mertz was a violent person. He was also a gambling addict, womanizer, animal torturer, and a raging alcoholic, an absolute degenerate, to say the least. And yet, women kept falling for him. In 1948, he moved in with a woman named Fern Spiva in the San Fernando Valley after making her his common-law wife. He stayed with her for 6 years. Spiva had a 10-year-old daughter from a prior relationship. That daughter was Barbara. Evans believed he groomed and molested Barbara along the way because that was one of his sick habits. He'd marry these young women who had young girls and then abuse them. In 1955, the year that Barbara got married, Mertz married another woman, his fourth wife, who already had 2 children, including a young daughter. In 1960, 15-year-old Marianne Pedrada, who had a horse stable next to Mertz's house and often rode horses with him, was stabbed 9 times and killed. But no one was linked to the murder. Then, in 1962, Mertz married his 5th wife, Ina. She too had a young daughter. In 1964, Mertz was arrested for molesting a 14-year-old girl. Although Mertz was suspected of multiple sexual assaults, that was the only victim for which he was arrested. That same year, Mertz showed up at a hospital with a gunshot wound. He claimed he was injured in an accidental shooting, but others believed someone intentionally shot him. Although investigators never discovered who shot Mertz and why, people around Mertz believed that it was most likely from a confrontation regarding Mertz's past abusive behavior, as well as the possible connection to the murders of Barbara Jean Jepson and Marianne Pedrada. In 1965, after his arrest for child abuse, Mertz was given a polygraph test by police who asked him about both the murders of Barbara Jepson and Marianne Pedrada. He denied ever knowing Barbara, but later it was discovered that he had attended her funeral and often visited her mom even after Barbara's death. Evans said the polygraph test results concluded that Mertz had definite guilty knowledge regarding the fate of the 2 murdered women, but Mertz could not be prosecuted with this alone, as polygraph test results are not admissible evidence in court. However, after this, suspicion mounted, and people started to notice that there was something wrong with him. One of the people who had suspected him was his own wife, Ina. She found the underwear of a young girl in a drawer in their house. On August 15, 1965, while he was out of jail, she confronted Mertz about whether he had been abusing the girl whose underwear he had. Suspicions already looming over him, this confrontation was the last straw, as Mertz then grabbed a gun and chased Ina outside to the street, shooting her multiple times and killing her. Afterwards, he returned to the house and killed himself. This murder-suicide would be the last depraved act in his pathetic criminal life. It was revealed that in 2017, a former stepdaughter of Mertz came forward to tell a shocking story. On the day that 15-year-old Pedrada was murdered, the then 10-year-old girl saw Mertz come back into the house with a bloody knife and blood on his hands and clothing. She was so terrified of Mertz that she waited 50 years to come forward with this information. Mertz apparently abused the girl physically and mentally by doing such things as stabbing her horse with a pitchfork. Despite being in her 60s, she said that the memories of Mertz still haunt her, and she's still afraid of him. Upon more digging, Evans learned that Mertz had a pattern of never leaving his victims alone, even after he remarried or when his stepdaughters grew up and moved out of the house. He would continue to abuse and sexually assault them until the time of his death. After some tiring research, Evans was able to track down Mertz's relatives still living in Utah. In September 2019, a search warrant for DNA was served on Mertz's 87-year-old son. Before the warrant, detectives were considering exhuming Mertz's body, but they were hopeful that the case could be solved by collecting his son's DNA. The son died just 2 weeks after giving his DNA to the detectives. Although there was not enough DNA to present, there was enough of a match to allow the cold case to be solved as per the standards of law enforcement, with 99% certainty that Mertz was Barbara's killer. He was also suspected of other murders and assaults. Evans said he would be charged with first-degree murder if he were still alive. Although many of the people directly affected by this tragic murder have long since passed, the pursuit of the American dream draws many from far and wide. For Shu Ming Tang, it was a chance to give his family a better life. However, that dream was snuffed out on the afternoon of April 26, 1993. Tang, a husband, father, and well-liked member of the San Carlos community, emigrated from Taiwan to California. A businessman at heart, Tang opened up a little mom-and-pop corner shop called the Devonshire Little Store. It was a hit with the community, and Tang was a welcoming and friendly store owner. The little shop thrived as the community grew to know and like the owner Tang. In a way, the corner shop that had always been a fixture in that part of town took on a new personality under the ownership of Tang, and it shocked the community when they learned that Tang had been shot and killed in the very store he'd owned. On the afternoon of April 26, 1993, San Carlos police officers responded to a 911 call for a possible shooting. Upon arrival minutes after the incident, officers found Tang, the store owner, bleeding out after sustaining a single gunshot wound. Emergency medical personnel rushed Tang to a nearby hospital. He, however, succumbed to his injuries soon after arriving at hospital. In the meantime, investigators were collecting information as eyewitnesses came forward to report that an adult female was seen fleeing the store soon after the shooting. She was described to be in her 20s, with shoulder-length brown hair. The car she was driving was a 70s blue station wagon. Allegedly, Tang had been alone in the store when the incident occurred. Investigators maintained that the shooting was the result of a robbery gone wrong, and were pursuing leads regarding the woman seen leaving the crime scene. The case received national attention and featured on America's Most Wanted. Although much attention was garnered by the crime, leads dried up for investigators. A reopening of the case in 2010 brought nothing new to the table. 8 years later, in 2018, it was an utter stroke of luck that brought the killer to justice. Oklahoma authorities were investigating an unrelated crime and stumbled upon a diary in a rural home in the town of Dewey, north of Tulsa. There they found a private journal titled Things I Regret. In it was an account of the slaying of a Korean man during a robbery in San Carlos in 1993. The owner of the diary, 61-year-old Rain Hoffman Ramos. She had been living in the rural house when police conducted the search. Another search was conducted at a residence in Sacramento by California officials on March 16, 2022. The searches, which were conducted simultaneously between California and Oklahoma, yielded supporting evidence against Hoffman Ramos. Records showed that Hoffman Ramos was a repeat offender that had been arrested multiple times on drug-related and other non-violent offenses. She was arrested and detained in Oklahoma, awaiting extradition to California. Although the diary mentions a Korean man, Tang was Taiwanese. The details matched the scenario that the investigators developed at the crime. Hoffman Ramos waived her rights to an extradition hearing and was brought back from Oklahoma to California, where she made a brief appearance in San Mateo County Court on April 13, 2022. She was arraigned in court on April 26, 2022, 29 years to the date of Tang's murder. Hoffman Ramos was charged with murder in the death of Shu-Ming Tang. Sheriff's Lieutenant Jacob Trickett said that the purpose of a cold case unit was to have a fresh perspective and to utilize more updated information management systems. That's basically one of the reasons we were led back to Rayne, he said. In July 1993, 3 months after the shooting, Tang's wife sold the store to another Taiwanese family. It had been a staple corner store for 87 years and remains open under new owner Chung Sun and his wife Ann Sun. Sun, who knows the family, said he still had questions about what took place. What happened 30 years ago? What did she do? He asked regarding the suspect. This gentleman never did a bad thing to any people, Sun told ABC7. San Carlos Mayor Sarah McDowell made a statement following the arrest of Hoffman Ramos. Mr. Tang was a husband, a father, and a friend who came to the United States to provide a better life for his family. His death shook the community of San Carlos and has remained a topic of discussion over the years. The Tang family have not spoken publicly, but authorities have been keeping them updated on the case and its proceedings. Sheriff Carlos G. Bolanos thanked the Tang family for their support over the years. The San Mateo County Sheriff's Office would like to thank the Tang family for their support. I hope that your family will finally get the justice and closure that you deserve, he said to the Tangs. Patricia Stichler. Patricia Ann Stichler was born on June 5, 1954, in Toledo, Ohio. She went by the name Patty to her loved ones and friends. In 1985, after having a divorce just a year earlier, 30-year-old Patty was a mother to 3 daughters, whom she lived with on the 5,000 blocks of Brinthaven Road in Sylvania, Ohio. Her eldest daughter, Andrea, was 11, middle daughter Kristen was 9, and the youngest, Elise, was just 5 years old at the time. By all accounts, they were growing up in a safe neighborhood. Patricia was the first female manager of the 21st Century Health Spas and worked there for more than 7 years. It was New Year's Eve. After dinner, Patty had put her 3 young daughters in bed when multiple calls came in. When Patty would pick up the phone, the person on the other end kept hanging up. This happened several times that night. When Andrea woke up the next morning, she could not find her mother. That is, until she came to the hallway and witnessed a horrific scene. Her mother's lifeless body was lying on the floor in a pool of blood. She was mostly nude. Panicking, she called her father, who then called the police. As police went to the scene, they found Patty's throat had been brutally slashed with many other injuries on her body. Investigators would not find signs of forced entry on any doors or windows, but there were knife cuts on the shower curtain and window coverings in the bathroom, where a window was found open. Blood splatters were discovered on the walls of 2 rooms. Blood was also found on the bed and the carpets. A DNA sample was collected from the scene. The most shocking part was that while Patty was being attacked, her 3 daughters slept just a few feet away in another bedroom, but they were left unharmed. An autopsy revealed that the young woman put up a brave fight, which led to the wounds on her hands and arm, but she was no match to the intruder who had a knife in hand and inflicted 19 stab wounds upon her. A few stab wounds to her abdomen were caused after she was dead. Investigators believe the assailant broke into the house through the bathroom window. She was most likely being watched before the attack, but they could not determine whether the assailant previously knew her or not. An unknown male DNA profile was developed from the evidence collected at the crime scene. Both Patricia's ex-husband and her boyfriend at the time were investigated extensively and ruled out early on in the investigation. Patricia's daughters swore to do everything in their power to bring justice to their mother. Through the years, they actively worked with the investigators in the case, which went cold pretty much after the first year of the murder. Andrea does not have a recollection of the fateful day due to the extreme trauma she went through after finding her mother in that state. When Rich Schnorr became the chief of the Sylvania City Police Department, he prioritized the Patricia Stichler case because this was the only unsolved homicide in the city. Among the 3 homicides that occurred in the town, the other 2 were solved pretty quickly. In 2018, a genetic genealogist built a family tree of the suspect from the DNA that was preserved for all these years and came up with some distant relatives, which then led to a biological mother. But she had given up the suspect for adoption, so the genealogists had to trace even further. Finally, all of their hard work would pay off, and the suspect was identified as Michael Mellis. Michael was just 17 years old at the time of the murder and lived only 6 houses down from Patty. He joined the army after graduating from high school, while his family left the community shortly after the murder, as did Patty's. Although he was so close, investigators never had him on the radar for Patty's murder. Patricia's family was shocked to hear this news. Finally, they had the closure they'd wanted for so long. The pain was irreversible for Patty's daughters, but they finally knew who took their mother from them after 37 long years of uncertainty. However, it was bittersweet, as Michael could not be brought to justice. As it turned out, in 1989, just 4 years after Patty's murder, Michael would die in a single-car road accident while stationed in North Carolina. Despite this, Patty's middle daughter, Kristen, now 46, has a sense of peace knowing who killed her mother and that he can no longer hurt anyone. On a snowy night in Colorado, officers rescued a man who had gotten his truck stuck in the snow on the treacherous Guanella Pass high in the Rocky Mountains. Unbeknownst to them, they just rescued a criminal that they would spend the next 40 years searching for. What crime did he commit? Welcome back to Mysterious 7, where we shed light on under-the-radar cases from across the globe. Today, we'll discuss a cold case finally solved after 40 years of searching for a man that was rescued on the very night of the crime. Without any further ado, let's get into it. This case takes us to Colorado, specifically around Guanella Pass, high in the Rocky Mountains. Guanella Pass is best known for its ski resort and hiking trails. It's a generally peaceful place, but this was not the case on January 6, 1982. That day brought a brutal winter storm to Colorado and became unforgettable to many in the state. On the evening of January 6, 1982, 29-year-old Barbara Oberholzer, also known as Bobby Joe, called her husband Jeff Oberholzer after work to let him know that she was going to be late. A couple of friends had invited her for drinks, so she was going to be out for a while. She also told Jeff that she'd make her way home by hitching a ride. Hitchhiking was very common in Breckenridge in those days. Jeff and Bobby Joe didn't live in Breckenridge. They lived in Alma, which was about a 30-minute drive from Breckenridge. After falling asleep waiting for Bobby Joe, Jeff suddenly awoke and checked the time. Bobby Joe definitely should have been home by then, because she did not normally stay out very late. Jeff got into his truck and went straight to the pub where Bobby Joe said she'd be. Her friends were surprised to see Jeff, and they told him that Bobby Joe had left much earlier. That was when Jeff knew something was wrong. He went to the police that night and reported his wife missing, but officers didn't file a missing person report. In those days, it was customary to wait at least 24 hours before filing a missing person report for an adult. Thankfully, this is no longer the case. On the same night, a plane heading to California flew over Guanella Pass. On the plane was a Colorado sheriff, Harold E. Bray, who looked out the window and saw something that caught his attention. It was flashing lights. Being a sheriff, Harold quickly understood that the lights were a distress signal. He alerted the pilot, who noted the coordinates and informed the Federal Aviation Administration. Soon, rescuers were able to locate the flashing lights and found a pickup truck that had gotten stuck in the snow. In the truck was a 30-year-old man named Alan Lee Phillips. Alan had gotten stranded while trying to cross the Guanella Mountain Pass. He was traveling without snow chains, which is why his truck got stuck in a snowdrift. Just when Alan had given up and thought he'd freeze to death in his pickup truck, he heard a plane flying overhead. Alan used his headlights to flash the SOS signal. But the officers became curious. When rescuers asked Alan why he was out there in the middle of the night, Alan said he was coming from a friend's place in Bailey and was heading home when he got caught in the snowstorm. His response satisfied the officers' curiosity, and they didn't find anything else suspicious. They simply gave Alan a lecture about preparing his vehicle for winter weather and subsequently dropped him off at home. The following day, Jeff received a call from a man telling him that Bobby Joe's driver's license was found on his property. He drove over there and picked it up. Jeff then gathered his friends, and together they started searching for Bobby Joe along the highway. Soon, Jeff spotted a blue backpack in the snow. They pulled over to have a closer look, and there they saw Bobby's glove with a splatter of blood and several tissues also soaked in blood. At that point, authorities were notified of the findings, and Jeff was sent home to wait while law enforcement and volunteers continued the search. Eventually, Bobby Joe's body was found off of Highway 9 near the summit of Hoosier Pass. After her body was examined, it was revealed that she was shot twice in the chest. Her wrists were tied with a plastic cord, and there were shell casings at the scene. During the search, Bobby Joe's belongings were found scattered far and near. Along with her body, they found a set of keys and an orange sock. Though the keys were identified to be Bobby Joe's, the orange sock, however, was not. On the same day, a 22-year-old woman named Annette Schnee was reported missing. Her disappearance was reported when she failed to show up at work. Annette worked at Breckenridge Holiday Inn and lived in Blue River. The last time anyone saw Annette was at a pharmacy in Breckenridge on January 6, 1982. According to those who saw her before she went missing, she planned to hitchhike home to change her clothes to get ready for her next shift, as she often did. But after she left, she was never seen again. What happened to Annette? Who killed Bobby Joe? Were the two connected? The officers began their investigations and were open about their suspects. They had set their eyes on Jeff Oberholzer, although no evidence connected him to the crime. Investigators found it suspicious that Jeff had no alibi to back up his claim that he was sleeping at the time of Bobby Joe's murder. Jeff was interviewed multiple times for both Bobby Joe's death and Annette's disappearance. Initially, Jeff told officers that he didn't know Annette, but later called to let them know that he had given Annette a ride months before she went missing. He said he was reminded of Annette's face as he'd been seeing her pictures a lot on the news. The officers were not satisfied yet. They asked Jeff to take a polygraph, which he passed. He'd always maintained his innocence, as well as annoyance with investigators insisting on his involvement. The investigation continued for months with no new leads. Exactly 6 months later, Annette's body was found on July 6, 1982, in a rural area in Park County, 20 miles from where she was last seen. She'd been shot once in the back. Annette had been sexually assaulted, and it seemed that she may have been redressed by the perpetrator, or forced to redress, as her clothing was in disarray. She was noticeably missing an orange sock, which looked like the one found with Bobby Joe's body. After the examination of the two murders, investigators believed that a single person committed both crimes. They estimated that Annette was picked up around 5 p.m. on January 6, 1982, and driven to the remote area where she was sexually assaulted and murdered, possibly in an attempt to stop her from escaping. The unknown suspect then went back to Breckenridge, where he found his second victim, Bobby Joe, and abducted her. Bobby Joe was not sexually assaulted, but was shot twice in the chest, which made investigators believe that she might have been trying to have a conversation with her attacker when she was shot. According to Jeff, Bobby Joe would never accept a ride from a total stranger, which made him believe that someone who lived in the area and knew Bobby Joe had committed the crime. By 2015, over 100 suspects had been investigated, and at the time it was believed that the person responsible for the murders had Park County connections. Other suspects included a cab driver who had assaulted a hitchhiker in 1982, and while in jail, had bragged to a cellmate about committing 2 murders and getting away with it. 2 other persons of interest were the woman that had been talking to Annette before her abduction, as well as a man whose photograph was found in her wallet. Neither was ever identified nor questioned. About 10 suspects were thoroughly investigated and had their DNA collected. Investigators also worked with 2 psychics, but their combined efforts did not lead to any breaks in the case. Eventually, the case went completely cold, since none of the suspects could be definitively tied to the murders. Years later, Jeff was finally cleared by DNA evidence after years of suspicion. Since the time of the tragic murders, the case has been handled by numerous agencies over the years and was featured on the television show Unsolved Mysteries in 1993 and again in 2007 on the Discovery Channel's Sensing Murders. However, in 1995, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation Denver Crime Laboratory conducted DNA testing to determine if the bloody glove and tissue that belonged to Bobby Joe contained Bobby Joe or Annette's DNA. Results indicated that blood on the glove and tissue didn't belong to either of them. In 2021, the case was put forward by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for Genetic Genealogy. After extensive searching through databases, a forensic genealogist analyst with United Data Connect was finally able to name Alan Lee Phillips, who was known to officers, as one of the 2 possible matches to the genetic profile obtained from Bobby Joe's glove. Investigators found that Alan had resided in Colorado since the early 1970s, and that he lived in Fairplay, Denver, Idaho Springs, and Georgetown before moving to Dumont. In early January 2021, officers placed Alan under surveillance, and on February 20th, surveillance indicated that Alan went to a Sonic drive-thru in Littleton and then to the Dumont post office. There, Alan threw away a brown bag inside the post office that was retrieved by police and taken to the DNA laboratory at CBI Denver. On February 23rd, the DNA samples from the brown bag were tested and found to be consistent with genetic profiles developed from the glove and tissue that belonged to Bobby Joe. Finally, on February 24th, 2021, Alan was arrested and taken to the Park County Jail, where he awaited his trial. On March 22nd, 2021, Alan was charged on multiple counts, including first-degree murder and second-degree kidnapping for both Annette and Bobby Joe. The trial began on August 29, 2022, in Park County District Court. Park County Detective Sergeant Wendy Kipple and Park County Special Deputy Charlie McCormack, who have both been key components in the prosecution of the case, gave their testimonies in the trial. The testimonies included strange occurrences on the night of the murder. According to Park County Sheriff Tom McGraw, Alan got stuck on Guanella Pass on the night of the murders, and they found the back of his vehicle submerged in the snow with his headlights pointing upward. David Montoya, a fire chief with the Empire Fire Department, was one of the first responders to Alan's situation and drove him home. He said he noticed a cut on Alan's forehead and blood on his jacket. According to McGraw, that incident had an impact on the trial because it placed Phillips in the area of 285, where pertinent evidence was located. This was not the first time Alan had trouble with the law. He was once arrested for burglary and assault in 1973. Though the 1973 case could not be used in the trial, it showed Alan's track record of assault. In the 1973 incident, Alan picked up a female hitchhiker coming out of Breckenridge, took her to a cabin off County Road 1, dragged her out of his vehicle, and beat her in the head with a rock. According to McGraw, who narrated the event, the woman screamed for him to stop and cried out, "I have a baby girl." Alan then broke into the cabin, cleaned her up, and dropped her off in Fairplay. The woman went to the police to report the harrowing incident. Alan was arrested and he confessed to the whole crime back in 1973. The night Alan was arrested in 2021, McGraw noticed some interesting occurrences that he shared in court. En route to the Park County Jail in Fairplay, with Alan seated in the back of a patrol vehicle, they passed the intersection where Alan picked up one of the victims in Breckenridge. They also passed the murder scene on Hoosier Pass, as well as the site where he dumped Annette's body in Sacramento Creek. McGraw recalled Alan complaining that he felt like he was going to be sick on 3 occasions at each of those 3 locations. He said he gagged, but he never threw up, but he was impacted by his return to each of those places. On September 15, 2022, after just 5 hours of deliberation, a jury convicted Alan Phillips on all 8 charges in the murders of Annette Shee and Bobby Joe Oberholzer. When Alan committed the murders, he was 31 years old, and even though he had once assaulted a hitchhiker, no one connected the dots. He was never a suspect in either case. He continued living his life normally. He got married and had children with no one chasing him. It was 39 years of freedom, according to Annette's sister, who said, "You had 39 years of freedom, and hopefully now it will all be taken away from you. 39 years of freedom too long." Alan Phillips, who's now 71 years old, faces life in prison. He'll be formally sentenced on November 7th, 2022. With the help of genetic genealogy and some very determined investigators, justice for Bobby Joe and Annette will finally be served after 40 years.